The Apollo Theater had a rule that every performer learned sooner or later: respect the stage, and the stage will respect you back. On a sweltering August night in 1965, that ancient principle was about to be demonstrated in a way that would become legend. James Brown arrived at the Harlem venue, carrying the weight of a title he had earned through blood and sweat. The hardest working man in show business. Inside the historic theater, anticipation crackled through the crowd like electricity. The marquee advertised a double bill, two of soul music's brightest stars sharing an evening that promised to showcase the genre's incredible power. Wilson Pickett was also on that bill, a tremendous talent whose voice could shake walls and whose recent hits had made him one of rhythm and blues' most exciting performers. He had every reason to feel confident about closing the show after James Brown's set. But what neither the promoters nor Pickett himself understood was that James Brown didn't simply perform songs. He transformed stages into something close to religious experience. And when he stepped into that spotlight, he was about to deliver a performance so devastating that it would redefine what was possible in live soul music. By the time the final note faded, everyone in that building would understand exactly why some stages belong to only one man. Before we continue with what happened that night, if you're enjoying these untold stories from music history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible moment like this one. Wilson, meanwhile, was riding high on the success of "In the Midnight Hour," a song that had topped the R&B charts and crossed over to white audiences in ways that few soul records had managed. The Apollo's booking agent had thought pairing them would create magic. Two different styles of soul music complementing each other in a celebration of the genre's diversity. What he failed to consider was that neither man had ever learned to share a spotlight without turning it into a competition. The running order had been decided weeks in advance. James would perform first, delivering his signature high-energy set, and Wilson would close the show with his smooth, gospel-inflected style that would send the audience home satisfied and spiritually fulfilled. On paper, it made perfect sense. James would get the crowd heated up, and Wilson would bring them back down with his powerful but more controlled approach. The promoter had even assured Wilson that closing position was the position of honor, the slot that audiences remembered most clearly when they walked out into the Harlem night. Wilson had accepted this arrangement without much thought, confident in his own abilities, and secure in the knowledge that his recent chart success had elevated him to a level where he could hold his own against anyone, even the legendary James Brown. But James Brown had heard about the running order. Something in his expression had shifted when the news reached him. His band members, men who had worked with him long enough to read his moods like weather patterns, recognized the look immediately. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't jealousy. It was something more primal, a determination that seemed to reach down into the deepest part of his being, where music and identity merged into something inseparable. He had built his entire career on a simple principle. When James Brown left a stage, there should be nothing left for anyone else to do. The audience should be so completely satisfied, so thoroughly exhausted from the emotional journey he had taken them on, that the idea of another performer following him would seem almost unnecessary. And now, here was Wilson Pickett, a tremendously talented singer, but still relatively new to headliner status, preparing to walk onto the Apollo's stage after James had finished, expecting to match or even exceed what the Godfather of Soul would deliver. The dressing rooms at the Apollo were cramped, hot, and filled with the ghosts of every great performer who had ever prepared for their moment in the spotlight. James Brown's pre-show ritual was legendary among musicians. Vocal warm-ups that lasted for hours, physical exercises that would exhaust most people before they even reached the stage. and a meditation process that seemed to transform him from a regular human being into something that existed purely to channel music through his body. His band, the famous Flames, sat in various corners of the room, instruments at the ready, watching their leader move through his preparations with the focused intensity of a boxer before a championship fight. Nobody spoke unless James spoke first. Nobody moved unless he gave them a signal. They had learned through years of experience that James Brown before a show was not a man to be interrupted or distracted. The stage manager moved on to Wilson's room, where the news that showtime was approaching was met with cheers and another round of handshakes. Wilson stood, stretched, and began his own warm-ups, though they were considerably shorter and less intense than what James had been doing for the past 3 hours. He was naturally gifted, blessed with a voice that could hit notes without much preparation, and he had come to trust that natural talent would carry him through any performance. What Wilson Pickett didn't know, couldn't have known, was that James Brown had spent the last hour making subtle adjustments to his planned set list. Songs were being added, arrangements were being tightened, and the overall structure of his performance was being redesigned in ways that would push him further than he had ever gone before. He had made a decision, though he never spoke it aloud, that this particular night at the Apollo Theater would be remembered not for who closed the show, but for the moment when soul music reached a height that had never been achieved before, and might never be achieved again. The house lights dimmed at exactly 9:30, and the Apollo crowd, already worked into a state of high anticipation, erupted in applause before anyone had even taken the stage. The announcer's voice cut through the noise, introducing James Brown with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious figures. And when the Godfather of Soul emerged from the wings, dressed in a suit so sharp it seemed to cut the air around him, the entire theater rose to its feet. This was the Apollo, where black excellence was not just celebrated, but demanded. And James Brown understood that every single person in that audience had come with expectations that he intended not just to meet, but to obliterate. He opened with "Out of Sight," and within 30 seconds, everyone knew this performance was different. His footwork was sharper, his spins tighter, his entire body operating at a level beyond anything they had seen before. He was singing differently, too, his voice reaching for notes and textures that pushed beyond even his considerable range, screaming and grunting and moaning in ways that transformed the song from a performance into something that felt dangerously close to possession. The famous Flames, professional musicians who had played these songs hundreds of times, found themselves working harder than usual just to keep up with the intensity their leader was demanding. Then, about 40 minutes into what was supposed to be a 45-minute set, James Brown did something that nobody, not even his own band, had anticipated. He called for "Please, Please, Please," the song that had launched his career nearly a decade earlier, and began to perform it with an emotional vulnerability that seemed to crack open his chest and expose everything inside. He dropped to his knees, still singing, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. The famous Flames gathered around him, concerned, and one of them draped the famous cape over his shoulders, a signal that the performance had become too much, that Mr. Brown needed to be helped off stage to recover. The audience gasped. Some women screamed, and there was a moment of genuine concern that something had gone terribly wrong. But then James shrugged off the cape, stood back up, and returned to the microphone with renewed intensity, his voice soaring even higher than before. The crowd went absolutely insane, screaming and crying and jumping out of their seats. He repeated the sequence again, dropping to his knees, accepting the cape, throwing it off, returning even stronger. And again, and again. Each time, the audience's response grew more frenzied, more emotionally invested, until the entire Apollo Theater felt like it might lift off its foundation and ascend into the night sky. What nobody in the audience understood, but what every musician in the building recognized, was that this was not just a performance technique. This was James Brown pouring out every ounce of pain from his childhood, every moment of rejection and struggle and doubt, channeling it all through his voice and his body in a display of raw humanity that transcended entertainment and became something closer to exorcism. Backstage, Wilson Pickett stood in the wings, watching this unfold with an expression that slowly transformed from confidence to concern to something approaching horror. He had performed at the Apollo before. He had closed shows for major artists. He had stood on stages across the country and commanded audiences with his powerful voice and charismatic presence. But what he was witnessing now was operating on a completely different level, something he had never seen before and wasn't sure how to process. The other musicians and stagehands who crowded the wings, all of them veterans of countless shows, were shaking their heads in disbelief. Some were openly crying. One old stagehand, a man who had worked at the Apollo since the 1940s and had seen everyone from Billie Holiday to Dinah Washington perform, leaned against the wall and whispered to nobody in particular, "Ain't nobody following that. Ain't nobody in the world." James Brown's 45-minute set stretched to 70 minutes, then 80, then 90. The promoter tried to signal that he needed to wrap up, that Wilson was scheduled to go on, that the theater had permits and curfews to consider. But there was no stopping what was happening on that stage. James had entered a state that musicians sometimes talk about but rarely achieve, where the performer disappears entirely and becomes nothing more than a channel for something larger and more powerful than individual ego or ambition. He cycled through his entire catalog, performing songs he hadn't planned to do, creating medleys on the fly, directing his band with glances and gestures, while simultaneously dancing with a ferocity that seemed to defy human limitations. His suit, so crisp and perfect when he had walked onto the stage, was now soaked through with sweat. His processed hair had begun to come undone, returning to its natural texture. His voice had gone hoarse from screaming, but somehow that hoarseness only added to the emotional impact of every note he sang. When he finally began to wind down, transitioning into a slow, gospel-tinged version of "Try Me" that had the entire audience swaying and sobbing. It was nearly 11 o'clock. He had been on stage for an hour and a half, delivering what many people who were present that night would later describe as the single greatest performance they had ever witnessed in any genre of music. As the final notes faded and James Brown, genuinely exhausted now, took his bow, the applause that erupted seemed to shake the building's very structure. People were standing on their seats, tears streaming down their faces, hands clapping until they hurt, voices hoarse from screaming. It wasn't just appreciation for a good show, it was gratitude for having witnessed. Something transcendent, something they would tell their grandchildren about decades later. Wilson Pickett sat in his dressing room, head in hands. When the promoter arrived, Wilson simply shook his head. There was nothing left to do. James Brown had taken everything. The promoter nodded, understanding but also calculating the financial implications of canceling half the advertised program. They settled on a compromise. Wilson would come out, sing 3 songs, thank everyone for coming, and send them home. It wouldn't be the triumphant closing set he had envisioned, but it would fulfill the contractual obligation and give the audience at least some of what they had been promised. Wilson Pickett walked onto the Apollo stage at 11:15, and the contrast was devastating. The audience, still emotionally drained from James Brown's performance, greeted him with polite applause, but nothing approaching the hysteria they had shown earlier. He sang In the midnight hour, beautifully, his voice as powerful as ever, his stage presence as commanding as it had been in every other venue he had played. But it didn't matter. The audience had already been taken to a place so high, so emotionally intense, that coming back down to even excellent standard soul music felt like a disappointment. Some people were already making their way to the exits, not out of disrespect to Wilson, but simply because they knew nothing could top what they had already experienced. After his third song, Wilson thanked the crowd, praised James Brown's performance, and left the stage. The whole thing had lasted maybe 20 minutes. What happened at the Apollo Theater that August night in 1965 became one of those stories that spread through the music industry like wildfire, growing slightly with each retelling but maintaining a core truth that nobody could deny. James Brown had delivered a performance so devastating that it had essentially ended the career trajectory of his co-headliner. Wilson Pickett continued to have hits, continued to perform to adoring crowds, and remained a major force in soul music for years to come. But he never again agreed to perform after James Brown. And when asked about it in interviews later in life, he would smile ruefully and say, "I learned something important that night. Some men are performers, and some men are forces of nature. You don't try to compete with a hurricane." The story also changed something in James Brown himself. In interviews conducted years later, he would sometimes talk about that Apollo performance as the night he fully understood what his gift meant and what responsibility came with it. He had not been trying to hurt Wilson Pickett or destroy his confidence. He had simply been trying to honor the Apollo stage, to give the audience something they would never forget, to push himself to limits he had never reached before. The fact that it had made following him impossible was almost incidental, a side effect of his commitment to absolute musical excellence rather than a calculated act of sabotage. But it also set a standard that he would feel obligated to maintain for the rest of his career, a standard that would eventually take a severe toll on his body and his relationships, but would cement his reputation as the hardest working man in show business. Musicians who were present that night, both in the audience and backstage, carried the memory with them throughout their careers. The story became a cautionary tale that promoters told young artists, "Never book anyone after James Brown, because he will make it impossible for them to succeed." It became an aspirational story that performers told each other in dressing rooms. This is the standard. This is what greatness actually looks like. This is the level you need to reach if you want to be remembered. The venue would host countless legendary shows over the years, from Aretha Franklin to Stevie Wonder to Lauryn Hill. But old-timers who had worked there since the early days would sometimes shake their heads and say, "That was something special. But you should have seen Brown and Pickett in '65. That was the night this stage learned what it could do to a man." What really happened that August night in 1965 was not a rivalry or a competition or even a particularly dramatic confrontation. It was simply a demonstration of what human beings are capable of when they commit themselves completely to their art, when they refuse to hold anything back, when they treat every moment on stage as an opportunity to transcend the limitations of normal existence and touch something eternal. James Brown did not set out to humiliate Wilson Pickett or to prove his superiority. He set out to honor the Apollo Theater, to respect the audience that had come to see him, and to push himself to limits he had never reached before. The fact that it made following him impossible was almost accidental, a natural consequence of excellence rather than a calculated attack. Wilson Pickett, for his part, learned a valuable lesson that night, one that served him well throughout the rest of his career. There are levels to this art form, and while talent can take you far, there is something beyond talent that only a few people ever achieve. James Brown had achieved it that night at the Apollo. and everyone who witnessed it, from the audience members to the musicians to the stage crew to Wilson himself, understood that they had seen something that might never be repeated. The story became legend not because of conflict or drama, but because it represented a perfect moment when an artist, a venue, and an audience aligned to create something that transcended entertainment and became art in its purest, most devastating form. The Apollo Theater still stands on 125th Street in Harlem, still hosting shows, still serving as a proving ground for artists who want to test themselves against the highest standards. And somewhere in the walls of that building, in the wood of that stage, the memory of that August night in 1965 remains, a reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, a performance can be so perfect, so complete, so absolutely devastating, that it redefines what we think is possible in music. James Brown gave the Apollo audience everything that night, and in return, the Apollo gave him immortality.